If I was an acquisition professional working with AI, and you're not like loving your job every day, you're in the wrong job. It's the most exciting time ever for acquisition. You are at the cutting edge of what the government is going to buy and going to shape the future of how government users and customers and the rest of the country interact with the government.
Hey everyone, I'm very excited about today's video. You may have noticed that we have released a few videos recently that cover artificial intelligence and its impact on government acquisition. The reason for this is we firmly believe that AI will transform both the way you work and the products that you will be buying. So, we decided to create a course called BuyAI. And as a part of building this course, we have interviewed some amazing experts. One of those experts is Steve Blank, an adjunct professor at Stanford University and the co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. In my interview with Steve, he talks about the rapidly evolving AI landscape and its implications for government acquisition. He emphasizes that AI has transformed from a niche application to an essential tool for the entire government. He highlights the need for agile contracting to keep pace with AI's fast-paced advancements, recommending constant engagement with commercial innovators. He also stresses the importance of adaptive contracting strategies, emphasizing the necessity of iterative processes that align with mission needs and the unpredictable nature of AI development. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Steve Blank.
So AI is a pretty exciting new branch of a new old branch of software. It's been around for 60 years, but only in the last couple of years has it actually produced output that's, I think, pretty interesting to the government, warfighters, and the rest. Generative AI, some of you probably are familiar with or heard about ChatGPT. That's the ability of AI to take a whole collection of terabytes of data and come up with the text or reasoning that you didn't even give it the question or train it on that specific issue, but it had such a large corpus of data. The neural net inside, that is the machinery inside of that AI, was able to generate answers that you didn't even know it knew, and it's still surprising us in many areas. Versus narrow AI, which might be data fusion or analytics on a specific task, or look at the imaging from overhead stuff and say this is an airplane, or this is a camouflaged X, or this is not real, etc. So those are very different types of AI, and sometimes they blend together, etc. But it is probably the most exciting time ever if you're in software or software acquisition. Actually, if you're in software acquisition, your head's exploding if it hasn't already. And if it's not exploding, you really don't understand the field yet. Well, it's really interesting. There's a entire website which I just discovered about all the use cases across all the government agencies. I think it's under AI.gov use cases. And when I went through the spreadsheet, I guess I got to line 761 of actual government use cases across not just the DoD, but all of everything from commerce to agriculture to NASA, whatever. I really suggest that every acquisition professional go take a look at that website, do a deep dive on not only the line items, but actually gives you, as you click deeper, the actual text description of what that program is. And it is probably the best first hour of education I would go do. Well, let me be specific though. For the DoD, there's some obvious cases, right? Data fusion, sensor fusion, battlefield management and planning, intelligence, etc. All the things we were hard coding before, or trying to do with data science and analytics. None of those are obsolete, but a lot of them could be developed and deployed in just a fraction of the time, and come up with some capabilities that are just pretty amazing. And again, maybe too deep for acquisition folks, but worth remembering. It could also operate at blinding speed, giving you answers that are just hallucinating. And so that's one of the problems with particularly generative AI is sometimes it makes stuff up, and it makes it up so well, it's convincing. And so part of this is where historically we worried about data quality, now we have to worry about data hallucination. Well, it's really interesting. I've been thinking about the AI implementation across the government, and probably the last two major shifts in software acquisition are probably worth contracting folks thinking hard about. The first one was when we had to adapt and adopt to the internet. Um, that just changed everything from maybe client server at their best or local applications on computers. And now all of a sudden there was this thing called the net and the web, and we had to build websites in every department that were facing users and maybe other government customers. And probably the next one after that, that most of us might remember, is actually the shift to the cloud. Again, another major transformation in acquisition and the deployment of services. I think from both of those, we should really be thinking about what were the lessons learned in acquisition and obsolescence, in contracting and the rest that we got right and that we also got wrong. And also what new policies are in place since those two major shifts have happened. I would kind of look at those as if I was an acquisition professional and go, boy, I wish we would have known X when we built website A or used vendor Z. We had a 10-year lock-in with software that got obsolete in 6 months. Well, what's really interesting is identifying the right opportunities for using AI comes from two places. One is, I will guarantee you, in the bottom of every organization inside the government are mission operators already experimenting with commercial tools, tools that developing themselves, etc. And usually there's a major disconnect from acquisition executives and those folks. So step one is find that body of knowledge inside your organization. And if you haven't found it, you're not looking hard enough, because I have yet to see a government organization that's not experimenting with AI. The second part, and this is most critical because we do a bad job of this, not just in AI, but in acquisition in general, is there's a major disconnect between what's going on in the commercial world and what goes on in the DoD, our service labs, and our FFRDCs and our primes. The clock speed, that is the rate of change, and even the delta rate of change, how fast that rate of change is occurring, is just unbelievable in the commercial world. I mean, I just got a hard to remember, but ChatGPT didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago, right? Where generative AI wasn't even a thing. We were hard coding, narrow AI cases. So if you're buying something, today, it's because it came out a year and a half ago, it's probably already obsolete. And that's just a little mind blowing. So what to do about that? One is tap into your groups inside your agency or organization who are experimenting. But two is you need a permanent process, permanent, not a one off visit, but a permanent process of doing what I call a technical terrain walk, actually getting out of the building and going and visiting vendors, not to see their shiny objects, but actually prepping them with, here are the problems my agency needs to solve. How would your software solve this? And actually, again, coming back, and not that we want to buy anything, and not that we just want to understand the state of the art. And if we're not doing that at least every 6 months, we're going to acquire things that are going to be obsolete the day we deploy them. That's and while that isn't necessary for software that's mature, that should be kind of a just a going in price of software that's changing at such a rapid pace. If we're not sampling at that same pace, we're going to make a mistake for our organization and the government writ large. And if I could kind of extend on this idea of the fact that things are changing so rapidly in AI software, what that really means is doing a FAR 15 contract negotiation is a little getting ahead of the game, meaning I would be doing some OTAs with maybe 6 months, with maybe 6 month extensions, until you start seeing the same thing again and again, meaning, oh, it's the software is really not getting better, over the last 6 months or years. That's not been the case for the last 2 or 3 years. And what I really am concerned about is that some prime convinces some smart acquisition folks, oh, name of large prime here, we really got thousands of people working on this, we really got it, etc. When I will guarantee you that's not the case, that you really don't want a FAR 15 contract right now for most AI stuff. If there's some very specific narrow things that need to be deployed, maybe, but again, it'd be like dialing into the internet and building a website in 1997 and realizing you just wrote a 10-year contract. It's obsolete by 1998. Well, what early adopters in the private sector who for AI have learned is that whatever they bought 6 months ago is now obsolete. Um, that's just a mind blower, and not obsolete because they made bad decisions, but there's an arms race between OpenAI and Google and Facebook and Microsoft and other incumbents about who's going to be the operating platform. That is, it's quite possible, at least for generative AI, that um, OpenAI or Claude or one of those becomes the new operating system. Then you start building applications on top of them. And so there's really a race of people investing tens of billions of dollars. Think about your budget versus what commercial companies are spending. Um, and we'll get back to that in a second. The second part is they're changing their pricing and business models almost daily. Um, a year ago, you had to pay X dollars a month to get access to X, Y, and Z. Now it's free. Why? Because there's an arms race for adoption. Imagine you would have locked the government into a per seat contract of paying last year's pricing when now they've changed it to a freemium model. Um, the second part is, and I mentioned this earlier, the amount of dollars being spent by commercial companies in building what are called large language models. That is, it requires tens of thousands of GPUs. You might have heard of NVIDIA chips and servers and tens of terabytes of data, etc. That far exceeds any budget for acquisition inside the DoD. It's hard to imagine. Most DoD things used to be historically who spent the most money. It's no longer true. So the question isn't that the DoD can't build these themselves. It's in fact, should you build them themselves, and can we take advantage of things that commercial companies are doing? Again, the whole cloud issue is a good example. Is yes, the DoD can and sometimes needs to build their own clouds, but now we've realized that why should we duplicate some of the massive investments that commercial companies are making? We're there already with AI, except unlike a cloud, which essentially the services are mostly the same, though incrementally changing, we're still on this exponential curve. There are lots of barriers about AI adoption for acquirers, and one is and I'm going to use this word not as a pejorative, but just as a fact of ignorance of both leadership and the acquisition professional, what the heck this stuff is. Do I buy it per pound, or do I buy it per feature, or do I buy it for outcomes, which maybe I should actually be thinking about? Um, because it's new to everybody, you shouldn't feel dumb that you don't have a clue about like what is this and what's the best, etc. The best advice is working with the departments or the mission centers that actually need some outcomes delivered. And then it becomes a little easier to start looking at what do I want to acquire that matches the outcome versus seeing a lot of vendors with shiny objects and, oh, gee, my large language model is bigger than this, or I could do X or Y or whatever. You really want that match between, warfighter or user needs and what is the value proposition or what is the product or service capable of doing, and more importantly, is how rapidly is that solution space changing, and what type of contract do I want to get the government into before I commit to a multi-year purchase of something that, as I said, might deliver features not wanted or needed, or worse, become obsolete or superseded by something else much better in 6 months. So one of the core to acquisition that I think is starting to permeate the acquisition community is this difference between waterfall contracting and agile contracting. And if there's ever a case for agile, AI is it. Why? Because in waterfall, waterfall works great, meaning it's a serialized process of I write a requirement and here are all the features, and I have a schedule, and the contractor performs per schedule and per feature and whatever. That's great when I actually understand the problem and solution and can compute both a priority. That makes all the sense in the world. I want to buy a pencil, or I want to buy a rifle, or I want to put up a website with these features. Kind of well understood, both problem and solution. AI and other things like that have a series of unknowns. I really don't know what outcome is actually even possible on day one. I might get what I asked for, I might get a lot less, or I could potentially get a lot better if I don't lock in a set of specific feature requirements, but I would actually start thinking about how do I iteratively and incrementally start testing and deploying this thing against the outcomes my agency or mission center or users were actually asking for. And if I can write contracts that way that are outcome driven rather than requirements driven, I will get a much better delivery and much better price performance and return on investment for the government and for the customer. The best example of this is what NASA did uh, crew resupply on a space station, and then also for actually sending crews up. They didn't buy the rockets; they bought the delivery of cargo, and they bought the delivery of people. The same experiment was when the U.S. Navy did Task Force 59 in CENTCOM. The Task Force 59 said, how do we use autonomous vehicles to conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance? Well, that task force had no money for acquisition of these drones on the sea. But in fact, they were creative and came up with a great acquisition idea of commercially owned, commercially operated. And so the drone manufacturers actually paid for their own drones, but the government bought the data. Um, and so now instead of having to figure out tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of acquisition of new equipment to get it in the palm and whatever, they were able to kind of scrounge up some dollars and use an OTA to just spend a couple $1 million to get the data and run a pretty interesting experiment that actually changed the Navy's view of the use of autonomous vehicles in an operating area. By the way, I want to go back to something I said before about learning the lessons about, what happened when we had to acquire stuff to build websites and, turn of the century, or what happened when we had to, go to the cloud. The Competition and Contracting Act and other new legislation and other things about AI safety and whatever have added an entire new layer of rules and regulations for acquisition professionals. And I just urge all of you to make sure that you're up to date on what the bounding box of both the acquisition rules and also AI safety rules, because, as I said, AI is both wonderful and terrifying at the same time. Particularly for generative AI, we sometimes don't know when it's lying. Um, and so we want to be pretty clear that we have either humans in the loop or have run enough cases that give us some certainty, or at least can let folks know whether the answers are going to be certain because it's been narrow AI and it's based on data science and analytics, or is it generative AI that's actually coming up with its own answers in a black box we still don't understand? To facilitate the adoption of AI really requires a change in mindset about um, acquisition, about how much you know about the vendors and the state of the art. Um, I can't emphasize how much and how fast the field is changing. You might have been an expert in January. At least for now, I will guarantee that it's obsolete in June. And that's tough in trying to make an acquisition decision. And it's impossible to do if all you're doing is sitting inside of the building, reading websites or moving like paper, which, by the way, is a good part of your job. You and your leadership need an active program to get out in front of these companies, both commercial companies, and seeing what is going on in the best practices in other areas inside the Department of Defense, inside other areas in commerce and NASA across the US government. As I said, there's a list of over 700 active AI programs as of last December, that are worth doing a deep dive in. And if you're not updating yourself and your leadership and your peers on what's going on, you're going to be acquiring things that are just not best practices or best of breed. Yeah. So Agile really is kind of a, you know, as far away from traditional procurement as one could think about. And it sometimes hurts people's head. Is, well, wait a minute, what's wrong with this specing a requirement? And here's all the features. I manage the contractor and contract to those features and delivery and timeliness, etc. And that's okay if we're starting with a series of knowns. That is, we know what the outcome is. We know what buying a rifle or putting up a website or, buying, a database looks like. But if the technology is changing so rapidly, and more importantly, if the user requirements are changing so rapidly, um, or if it's so new that no one quite knows what these capabilities could do, I'm going to write a requirement that is fundamentally wrong. It's wrong about my understanding of the problem, and certainly wrong about my understanding about the solution that's needed to be delivered. So what should we do? Well, the current model of what's called waterfall, that is spec, manage the process, write a contract, etc., um, can be replaced by Agile. Agile says, no, I'm not going to specify every feature on day one because I don't know it. I could specify a set of outcomes, and I can insist that the contractor actually deliver iterative and incremental versions of the product or service that the users get to comment, use, etc. And then we modify that. And this is a incredibly counterintuitive idea. We have permission in Agile to do something called a pivot. A pivot says when the facts in front of us say we were wrong about our assumptions about the problem or the features or the complete solution, we're allowed to change without getting fired or lawsuits or protests or whatever, by saying, well, the circumstances are now different from the day we started. Here's what we need to do. Well, that's really tough within the existing, FAR 15. But there is now opportunities to do that with specialized contracting vehicles, where, as I said, we could do lots of different models about contractor owned, contractor operated, by the data, by the outcomes, et cetera, using OTAs. So if you're thinking about how do we keep pace with this change, trying to shove all this into the old standard way of I know the problem and I know the solution is going to end up with very unhappy outcomes of both the agencies or groups you were trying to supply the software to and your frustration as a contracting officer. Identifying the most promising areas for AI is almost like looking through the wrong end of the telescope. I would start by thinking about do I deeply understand the problem we want to solve or the problems we want to solve, and I would socialize those problems with a wide range of folks, both inside the government first. Anybody solving X or Y? As I said, there are 700 instances. First thing I would probably do is build a cheap AI to kind of mine those 700 instances to build. I already have students, and there are lots of examples of people building generative AI to mine the FAR and mine Title 10 and Title 50 to say, do I have the authority to do X or Y? That should be the first thing that gets built. But the second is I would be socializing the problems constantly with venture capitalists, startups, accelerators, AFWorks, SpaceWorks, NavalX, services. There's 100 incubators across the DoD. I would be making sure that the problems are well understood by a wide range of institutions inside and outside the government, and then let them know not that you have a broad area announcement, or I would also add DIU and InQtel to that list as well. DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, which is the bridge between Silicon Valley and DoD, and InQtel, the venture capital firm for intelligence community. And I would be actively soliciting, tell me what I'm missing about the state of the art, or are these things possible to solve? And then you'd be able to filter those down to, are these worth a visit? Are these worth a show me you could do something? Or is this worth a short OTA or contract to build me a prototype of X in the next 90 days? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we want a continuous funnel. The problem is we do these, as if we do them at all, as one-offs. But hey, look, I already visited Silicon Valley, or whether it was Boston or Austin or wherever that was, or I already got a program with Research University X, Y, and Z. Yes, all those are great, but they need to be continuous in areas that are changing rapidly. If this was a static area, yeah, having a yearly visit or update is just fine, or every couple of years, send me a memo. But it's something that's moving so rapidly. Plus, we need a way inside of our acquisition organizations to communicate with each other what we learn. And while AI.gov is a good step, And in fact, it was a great step in discovering all these other use cases. I think implementation cases are actually even better. So how did it actually work when you did X or Y? Or how, did this vendor actually deliver what they said? Or was the spec great, but the delivery didn't match expectations? What I mean by socializing the problem is simply sharing it in a way that doesn't look like a requirement and violate 53 government regulations about giving unfair advantage to particular vendors. What I mean by that is that, yeah, we have great, RFPs and whatever, but just letting industry know about here are the types of things we're trying to solve, right? And by the way, some of them are common across a set of government agencies. There are some of them, maybe like sensor fusion, are very particular to DoD. So I teach a class called Hacking for Defense, and it's now in 60 universities, and we get problem sets across the DoD and IC. A good number of them are scrubbed into proxy problems. So while it might be classified on one side of the building, we could give a generalized example to students, so we've socialized the problem to a wider base than just the folks with having clear tickets. Well, if I was an acquisition um, person, I'd certainly be subscribing to the newsletters that follow, AI, and I could make a list, but it'll be obsolete by the time. In fact, this is something else that should be shared across the acquisition community. What are the commercial newsletters free that you should be reading at least daily or every week? Because I'd say every other day, I read it could do what, and then I go in and demo it and go, wow, and I'm not even acquiring anything. So if you're not doing, in fact, that's the first test. If you're trying to acquire AI and you're not receiving any of these acquisition newsletters, and again, you should all be sharing what are the best ones in your domain, and there's some great general ones, and you're not trying out at least a demo a day, you're really not like doing your job. Um, I just think it right now, trying to acquire AI for the government is probably the most exciting job an acquisition executive. And if you're not like giggling every day and enjoying it, go find another job because it is incredibly exciting. You want to get acquisition folks, um, get your head out of the paperwork in front of you, and you want to point yourself out of the building. Not physically all the time, but you truly want to understand how dynamic this AI space is and figure out how to best match that dynamism with what the user needs are, and how do I get things in the hands of people who need it now? Because the other problem is the other extreme is, well, why don't we wait? It's going to get better in 6 months or a year or 2 years. Yes, it's like trying to decide when to buy the right PC because next year's will be faster, or the next phone. Well, of course, next year's will be faster, but what do we need now, and how long is it going to last? In fact, maybe that an analog is probably useful, at least in the consumer world. We don't buy iPhones or Google Android phones to last 15 years, right? We buy them for our needs now, knowing that there's probably something in another 2 or 3 years that we're going to toss this one out or send it back for some refund and get a new one. The DoD traditionally has a different mindset, is things need to have 30-year life cycles and .mlpf and whatever. Boy, if we try to apply those same principles right now to an industry that's exponentially changing, we're going to lock ourselves into you know, stuff that not only is obsolete, at least for stuff that warfighters need, that will put us at a disadvantage. We need a mindset that says we're going to need to refresh this stuff at least every 18 months, if not sooner. Boy, that's what kind of acquisition authorities do we have for that? That's what I'd be thinking about. If we're trying to use the same ones that we're using for buying Windows or Macs, then we're just on the wrong path. Not until it stabilizes, and we're certainly not on a stable course for AI. Oh, I do have one other thing. The government has this is how to set up a AI program office. The government has gone back and forth, and so has CDAO, about whether there should be a AI only office, the Jake, or should it be integrated into the larger software effort in the government. And that goes back to, where does AI expertise sit? Should there be a central repository of people who build the AI apps for the missions or for the agencies? or should it be pushed down and distributed to the lowest possible level? That's the first level of conversation you're going to want to have. Um, I happen to have an opinion, um, but I think what's really going to matter is how does your organization, how does CDAO, et cetera, see where does AI expertise sit? Again, is it a specialized area, or is it done by our contractors, or is it done by procuring third-party applications, or is it done by the uh, agencies and groups themselves? So first order question needs to be answered.
Do you want to tell us your opinion?
Yeah, my opinion is there needs to be a kind of a central, almost consulting firm in the government of AI expertise. But unless we start pushing down the ability to develop AI applications into the lowest possible parts of the organization, we're really going to put ourselves in a disadvantage. We'll overwhelm, right? A 3 million person organization. We can't hire enough people in a centralized organization. So I think we want them to provide maybe the best practices, best tools, maybe APIs, like Jake was trying to do in the beginning, of maybe common ways to connect data or think about that. Um, but I don't think they should be building all the apps. Um, I think what they could also be doing is best practices of working with commercial industry, which again, we've not done a good job at, and in general, but in particularly a field that's moving so fast. I think a centralized organization could be helpful in pointing local organizations to those resources. Lean and customer development are based on a few simple premises. The first is there are no facts inside the building, so get the heck outside. Right? If you're just reading about this or you're just kind of making it up, it's like you're really going to be doing yourself and everybody else at the service. You need to get out and, in this case, constantly refresh your knowledge about what's going on inside your agency. Where are those islands of excellence who are already, even though you could swear that they don't exist, trust me, they exist. The people already experimenting, and then what's the best practices outside? Um, the second part is that you and the users who are asking you for these things, all they usually have on day one is a series of hypotheses, which is a fancy word for they're just guessing. Um, they're just guessing about the problem, and they're just guessing about the solution. And your job is to help them turn that faith into facts as rapidly as possible. And that requires you to actually challenge some assumptions and actually test some assumptions. And as we talked about earlier about using lean methodology in contracting, we could actually build iterative and incremental pieces of the solution and test them in front of the potential users as rapidly as possible. Um, that's different from I looked on the websites and found, somebody's report of the top 10 AI things, and I'm done. Not really. That's not really market research. That's like, CYA research. Um, I usually found unless you could actually demo a product or explain a demo that you've just seen, you really don't understand what you're buying. Whoa. If I was running one of these acquisition groups and somebody said, well, you need to buy X, I'd say, great, demo it to me. We'd be having a much different conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, so not everything needs to be demoed, but you certainly need to understand how does what we just think we want to acquire match what the users have said they think they need, or the organization thinks they need, or the customers outside. If I was building something to mine VA emails, of people who have questions with generative AI, great. How am I testing this thing? Who has the base? Has somebody done this in the civilian world for customer service? And how do I know? And how quickly is this changing? And how much are we going to be locked into this vendor? Is there a vendor lock on the data, et cetera? So the good news is, if you're an acquisition person inside the government, the odds are you probably won't be the first. Maybe you will, but again, as I mentioned, there are over 700 case studies of on AI.gov of people who've already implemented and acquired things in AI for government solutions. So one is I'd be doing, case study analysis before I do competitive analysis. Is So what happened when they did something that looked like mine, and how did they pick a vendor? And that is, I'd be actually asking the folks inside the government, how did it go? What did you learn about those acquisition lessons? In fact, I'm now thinking that's probably something else the government and CDAO should be doing. What are the lessons learned in AI acquisition? Do we have any? That is, we have some nice case studies, but I'm not sure we have acquisition lessons learned in a rapidly changing field. And as I mentioned earlier, we went through this when we started building websites at the turn of the century, and we went through this when we started going to the cloud. I'm not sure I've seen a lot of acquisitions lessons learned. Imagine them like written like Harvard case studies. We thought we were going to do X. Here's what happened, and we could even blank out the names of the vendors just to not particularly embarrass the whatever, or even not embarrass the acquisition person. But what went right and what went wrong can really inform acquisition executives today. We're really missing that body of knowledge. So, IP ownership for software is a big deal about, uh, and it's a big deal for startups for sure. Um, Government has a need to find alternate vendors, and startups need to own their intellectual property to be able to sell stuff to others. Um, and in fact, if you go ask Palantir about that, you get one answer. And if you ask the government, who's been paying Palantir now for years, there you get another answer. The solution might be, by the way, rather than owning the IP of the source code or the IP of the app, is owning some level of an application programming interface where you could say, no, I need the output of this so other people could plug in or whatever. Um, but acquisition folks really need to understand the business model of startups, small businesses, and their investors. And if you don't understand that, you'll start asking for ludicrous things, which will drive away the most innovative companies that could help the government. This is a big idea. If you can't go up to a whiteboard and draw for me how a startup and their venture capitalist makes money, yet you're writing a contract to one of those companies insisting on a set of data rights, you're essentially being a denial of service attack on the country and the industry. Don't do that. It might be that in some cases those are just incompatible and you need to pass. But there are other cases that when the light bulb goes on in your head of, oh, this is not only this company being obstinate, but this is how this industry works, then there are other places in the FAR you can use to be creative and to ask for it. But if you're just insistent because it says I need to ask for X, um, I've seen this wasted battle time and again on IP rights by acquisition folks not understanding how the business of early stage ventures work. I think the DoD has done a really good job, starting with the JAIC, about putting ethical rules for AI in place, everything from warfare to facial recognition, etc. And I think in a perfect world, those are great rules. I think what we might discover is that in wartime against an adversary or a non-nation state like ISIS, Al Qaeda, and the rest, um, they don't have a ethical set of rules, and we might have decided that since we hardwired ours that require a human in the loop, we might be at a disadvantage. And um, I think we need to consider both. Certainly, we need ethical rules of how we use data and AI as a democracy. Period. That's who we are, and um, I wouldn't want it any other way. But I'm sure hoping we're considering about what happens when we face an adversary or a system that's designed not to have any rules. That's also equally important. If I was an acquisition professional working with AI, and you're not like loving your job every day, you're in the wrong job. It's the most exciting time ever for acquisition. You are at the cutting edge of what the government is going to buy and going to shape the future of how government users and the customers and the rest of the country interact with the government. Um, my only if you're not loving your job and you're still using the same rules and the same, you know, acquisition pathways and whatever, you need to step back a bit and go, well, wait a minute, AI is different. These rules are different. How do we, in fact, accelerate the adoption of this rather than, in fact, figure out how to slow it down? But how to accelerate the adoption within the bounds of the rules and regulations we have? And there are plenty of ways to do that. So, welcome to the greatest job in the world.